Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Last night, I ordered U.S. military forces to Panama. No president takes such action lightly.
As the nation remembers former President George H.W. Bush, we look back at the defining moment of his first year in office, the 1989 invasion of Panama, which killed some 3,000 Panamanians. We'll speak with historian Greg Grandin.
The invasion of Panama took place a month after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and it really set the terms for future interventions in a number of different ways. One, it was unilateral. Two, it was a violation of national sovereignty. And three, it was a preview to the first Gulf War.
The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has just called on Washington to pay reparations for the U.S. invasion of Panama. We'll speak with one of the attorneys, Jose Luis Marin, who brought the case. And we'll talk to the celebrated Chilean writer Ariel Dorfman. His latest piece, headlined, George H.W. Bush thought the world belonged to his family. How wrong he was. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Wisconsin, protesters took to the state capitol Monday evening to oppose an effort by Republican state lawmakers to push through a series of bills to strip power from incoming Democratic Governor Tony Evers before he takes office. Protesters flooded the Capitol building chanting, "Respect our votes," and "Shame." The bills aim to limit the power of the Democratic governor and attorney general-elect and would restrict early voting periods. The Republicans drafted the legislation after Republican Governor Scott Walker lost a close race to Evers in November. In North Carolina, election officials are investigating possible fraud in a tight congressional election that remains uncalled nearly 1 month after the midterm elections. Unofficial results have Republican Mark Harris leading Democrat Dan McCready by just over 900 votes. The investigation centers on a number of absentee ballots which appear to have been signed by witnesses who have ties to Leslie McCrae Dowless, a Republican operative who worked for Harris. Dowless pleaded guilty to insurance fraud in the 90s after he took out a $163,000 policy in a dead man, according to court records. Additionally, a disproportionately high number of requested absentee ballots were not returned in a county that favored Harris in both the primary and general elections. The North Carolina Elections Board may decide to hold a new election if they're unable to declare a winner. President Trump lashed out at special counsel Robert Mueller and his own former personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, on Twitter Monday. Trump responded to Cohen's lawyer's request for prison time served by tweeting Cohen deserves, quote, a full and complete sentence. Last week, Cohen pleaded guilty to lying to Congress to help cover for Trump. Trump also praised his longtime advisor, Roger Stone, for having, quote, guts for agreeing not to testify against him. Some experts, including George Conway, litigator and husband of White House counselor Kellyanne Conway, have said the tweet amounts to witness tampering, which is considered an obstruction of justice. Special counsel Mueller is expected to file a sentencing memo today for Michael Flynn and sentencing memos for Michael Cohen and Paul Manafort in the coming days. CIA Director Gina Haspel is set to brief senators on the murder of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi today. She'll reportedly meet with a small number of top members of the Armed Services Committee, Foreign Relations Committee, and the Intelligence Committee. Last week, Haspel was reportedly blocked from a congressional briefing, prompting outrage from senators who instead had a closed-door meeting with Defense Secretary James Mattis and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Haspel's the only high-level U.S. official to have heard the tape of Khashoggi's murder after other members of the administration, including Trump himself, refused to listen to it. In Spain, the far-right Vox party won multiple seats in a regional parliamentary election in Andalusia Sunday, the first successful election for the far-right in Spain since the country returned to democracy in the 70s after the death of military dictator Francisco Franco. Former Trump advisor Steve Bannon threw his support behind Vox early this year and has apparently been advising the far-right party. Vox campaigned on an anti-immigrant, anti-abortion platform, as many worried about the rise of fascist political populism in Spain. In France, Prime Minister Edouard Philippe has suspended fuel tax hikes in an attempt to quell the growing tension between President Macron's government and protesters. An 80-year-old woman reportedly died over the weekend after a tear gas canister flew into her home, hitting her in the face. More than 400 protesters were arrested across France over the weekend. In Paris, cars and several buildings were set on fire, windows were smashed, police fired tear gas, stun grenades, and water cannons at protesters. Multiple journalists have reported being attacked by protesters since the demonstration started, both in person and online. Qatar announced plans to withdraw from the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, known as OPEC, after over 50 years of membership. Several OPEC members, including Saudi Arabia, have cut off trade with Qatar since 2017, accusing the country of supporting terrorists after it reestablished diplomatic ties with Iran. Newly inaugurated Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador is following up on a campaign promise to create a Truth and Justice Commission to investigate the 2014 disappearance of 43 students from a teachers' college in the town of Ayotzinapa in Guerrero. The students were attacked by local police as they headed to a protest and are presumed dead. International experts say the Mexican military and federal police also played a role in their disappearances. In news from the Philippines, the founder of the independent news site, The Rappler, has returned to the country despite facing an arrest warrant on tax evasion charges. Maria Ressa was in the United States, where she received multiple press freedom awards when she and her organization were indicted in what is widely viewed as an attack against the press by the authoritarian Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte. On Monday, Ressa posted bail but vowed to continue reporting.
I am not a criminal. I have been a journalist my entire life. I will continue to hold the government accountable.
Maria Ressa is due to appear in court later this week. Visit our website, DemocracyNow.org, to see our interviews with her. A U.S. admiral found dead at his home in Bahrain over the weekend reportedly died by suicide. Vice Admiral Scott Sterney oversaw U.S. naval forces in the Middle East. Back in the United States, calls are growing for Texas to halt its executions after BuzzFeed revealed the state buys its lethal injection drugs from a Houston pharmacy whose license has been on probation since 2016. As they were dying, 5 of the 11 prisoners Texas executed this year said their bodies felt like they were burning after they were injected. The process is supposed to be painless. 2 more executions are scheduled this month, including one tonight. Gloria Ruback of the Texas Death Penalty Abolition Movement protested Monday outside Green Park, compounding pharmacy and gifts.
Let us know now that you will stop making, compounding lethal injection drugs. If you do not, you will face an international campaign to boycott your business, and we will shut you down.
In St. Louis, 3 police officers were indicted last week in the assault of an undercover police officer at a 2017 protest. The undercover officer, who is black, was at a demonstration protesting the fatal police shooting of 24-year-old Anthony Lamar Smith when officers Dustin Boone, Randy Hayes, and Christopher Myers violently attacked the veteran police officer, kicking and beating him with a baton and causing serious injuries. A 4th officer, Bailey Coletta, was indicted for her role in helping to cover up the attack. Before the attack, the officers exchanged messages suggesting they, quote, whoop some ass and, quote, grab and toss protesters around. In Alabama, an autopsy of the man shot dead by police Thanksgiving Day after reportedly being mistaken for a gunman revealed he was shot 3 times in the back. 21-year-old Mantic Fitzgerald Bradford Jr. was killed by police after they responded to a shooting at a mall in a suburban Birmingham where 2 teenagers were injured. A lawyer for Bradford's family says the autopsy confirms the victim was not a threat and that he was moving away from the police. Nexstar Media Group has announced it'll acquire Tribune Media for over $4 billion, making it the largest provider of local television stations in the United States. In August, Tribune Media pulled out of a proposed merger with right-wing Sinclair Broadcast Group. The FCC had expressed concerns about the merger with Sinclair despite rolling back rules that prevented consolidation in local media markets in 2017. And in Canada, Indigenous activists have been physically blocking the construction of the largest fracking project in Canada's history. Members of the Unistata clan stopped TransCanada Corporation workers from entering their territory on November 20th. The land on the western coast of Canada is in the path of the planned $4.7 billion Coastal GasLink pipeline. Last week, TransCanada applied for an injunction against the Indigenous community in an attempt to gain access to the land. This is Frida Hewson, a spokesperson for the camp.
The project's going to impact our waters, our salmon, our berries, our medicines, and everything that is our critical infrastructure is at risk. If the court grants them that injunction, that gives the police the right to try and come in and do a raid and take us down, they would try to take us out of our own home, which we haven't committed no crime. We're just living on our land. We've never ceded or surrendered our land. We've never lost it through treaty or any other means, and we've never given up our decision-making power to any outside entities.
And a correction to an earlier story. Edouard Philippe is the Prime Minister of France. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world. We begin today's show by continuing to look back at the legacy of George H.W. Bush, the nation's 41st president who died on Friday at the age of 94. His body is now lying in rest at the Capitol. A funeral service will be held at Washington National Cathedral on Wednesday. Former Presidents Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, Jimmy Carter, and Bush's son, George W. Bush, will attend, as will President Trump, who was not invited to speak. A second funeral will be held Thursday in Houston, where George H.W. Bush will be buried.
While President Bush's death has dominated the news for days, little attention has been paid to the defining event of Bush's first year in office, the invasion of Panama. On December 19, 1989, President Bush sent tens of thousands of troops into Panama, ostensibly to execute an arrest warrant against its leader, Manuel Noriega, on charges of drug trafficking. General Noriega was once a close ally of Washington on the CIA payroll. In a nationally televised address, Bush claimed the invasion was needed to defend democracy in Panama.
Last night, I ordered U.S. military forces to Panama. No president takes such action lightly. This morning, I want to tell you what I did and why I did it. For nearly 2 years, the United States, the nations of Latin America and the Caribbean, have worked together to resolve the crisis in Panama. The goals of the United States have been to safeguard the lives of Americans, to defend democracy in Panama, to combat drug trafficking, and to protect the integrity of the Panama Canal Treaty.
During the attack, the U.S. unleashed a force of 24,000 troops equipped with highly sophisticated weaponry and aircrafts against a country with an army smaller than the New York City Police Department. An estimated 3,000 Panamanians died in the attack. But the war was highly sanitized in the U.S. media. This is part of the trailer for the Oscar-winning documentary Panama Deception.
1 year ago, the people of Panama lived in fear under the thumb of a dictator. Today, democracy is restored. Panama is free.
And to say we invaded Panama because Noriega, I don't know how Americans can be so stupid to believe this. I mean, how can you be so stupid?
The performance of the mainstream news media in the coverage of Panama has been just about total collaboration with the administration. Not a critical perspective, not a second thought.
Our regret is that we were not able to use the media pool more effectively.
You would think from the video clips that we had seen that this whole thing was just a Mardi Gras, that the people in Panama were just jumping up and down with glee.
They focused on Noriega to the exclusion of what was happening to the Panamanian people, to the exclusion of the bodies in the street, to the exclusion of the number dead.
The truth of the matter is that we don't even know how many Panamanians we have killed.
Panama is another example of destroying a country to save it. The United States has exercised a might makes right doctrine among the smaller countries of the third world to invade these countries, get what we want, and leave the people that live there to kind of rot.
The invasion sets the stage for the wars of the 21st century.
The trailer for The Panama Deception, directed by Barbara Trent, which won the Oscar last month. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights called on Washington to pay reparations to Panama over what was widely seen as an illegal invasion. For more on George H.W. Bush's legacy and the lasting impact of the Panama invasion, we're joined here in New York by Greg Grandin, prize-winning author, professor of Latin American history at New York University. His forthcoming book, titled The End of the Myth from the Frontier to the Border Wall in the Mind of America. His previous books include Kissinger's Shadow, The Long Reach of America's Most Controversial Statesman, and Empire's Workshop, Latin America, the United States and the Rise of New Imperialism. His latest piece for The Nation, headlined George H.W. Bush, Icon of the WASP Establishment and of Brutal U.S. Repression in the Third World. Professor Grandin, welcome back to Democracy Now! Tell us about the Panama invasion.
Well, it was consequential in that it was the major deployment of U.S. troops since Vietnam War, and it was done in a spectacular fashion. It was calculated to overturn what Bush said clearly was the Vietnam syndrome. It was a turning point in international law in the sense that it overthrew the doctrine of sovereignty, which had been the bedrock of the international system since at least the 1930s, 1940s, the idea that countries can't invade or intervene in another country's politics without multilateral consent. The OAS condemned the invasion. The UN didn't support the invasion. It was carried out as George H.W. Bush said, in the name of democracy, which is another important, significant motive. Came just a couple of weeks after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the United States had justified its previous interventions either in the name of anti-communism or national security or hemispheric security. This was a return to a certain kind of moralism to justify U.S. militarism. And in all of those ways, it set the stage for the wars to come. The legal doctrine, the way it was executed, the spectacular nature of shock and awe, the sending of 30,000 troops into Panama and being covered. Just think of it. Just compare it to maybe Kissinger's secret bombing of Cambodia for years. That had to be done off the books because the U.S. public was opposed to war for the most part. And so this was a real turning point in the public's acceptance of war and the executive branch's ability to justify and wage war. It was consequential in numerous ways that led directly to the catastrophe that we're in today.
And Greg, in terms of the historical significance, there had been a prior, even smaller invasion when Bush was vice president and Reagan was president of Grenada, a country of less than 100,000 people. Right. But this was actually a more substantial nation. Panama at the time had about 2.4 million people, it also, I think, it set a lot of the direction in terms of how media covered the war, because I remember there was a big uproar among the press in the United States because initially the government wasn't allowing any press to cover the war. Then after much protest, they agreed to send one plane of reporters on the second day. And I was reporting for the Daily News back then and participated in that plane flight. We were held. The press was actually held by the military on one of the military bases until several of us protested and were able to actually break free. We had to escape the American military base to be actually be able to go out and cover the war. But most of the press treated this, as you say, illegal invasion as a liberation effort.
Yeah, well, part of the remedy to overcome the Vietnam syndrome was figuring out how to control the press. There was an analysis that the press had gone off reservation in Vietnam, that they had developed their independent sources, that they weren't listening to the Pentagon, that they were critically analyzing the wars, that a whole generation, a whole cohort of investigative journalists, Cy Hirsch, Michael Herr, cut their teeth in Vietnam and were critical of U.S. foreign policy. That was a problem that needed to be solved. And Panama allowed them to try out different ways. And you experienced it directly when you covered Panama. And they just got better at it until they got to the first Gulf War and the second Gulf War, where the press were kept in embedded coverage and all of that.
Juan, explain what it was like to be on that plane and who was holding you on the military base.
Well, it was actually the because you have to understand, Panama was already occupied by the United States. There were several military bases in the Canal Zone because the Canal Zone had not yet been returned to Panama. So the U.S. military was already there. But then once the plane of the press landed on the second day, December 20th, we were basically held on the base. And they would bring out prisoners for the press to interview that they had captured, detainees they called them, that they had captured. But they were not allowing the press to go out and actually cover the attacks on Panama City. There was almost a near rebellion of the reporters saying, no, we got to go out and see what's going on. So they finally allowed some people to go out in buses, all with driven by the military, with military escorts. And then a handful of us managed to actually escape the buses. We demanded that we be let out into the city so that we go out and actually cover what was going on.
Yeah, I mean, in Panama in 1989 and through the early 1980s, the U.S. was watching a generation of reporters that had honed their skills and critical thinking in Vietnam applied to Central America. Ray Bonner's coverage of El Mozote, and so all of that.
Ray Bonner, who was writing for the New York Times,
right? He was writing for and lost and was reassigned because he was too close to the story.
El Mozote being a massacre in El Salvador.
In 1981 in El Salvador. And there was also ways in which reporters were just developing their own independent sources. They were too autonomous, they were too critical, and all of that had to be controlled, and they had to be brought back in and reestablished as a pillar of the national security state, whether as cheerleaders or as just uncritical commentators and catalogers of what was happening.
And the issue of Noriega's prior relationship to the CIA, and George Bush, having been a CIA director at one time, was well aware of Noriega's role.
Yeah, he was our man in Panama. He was a key asset in Iran-Contra, and Iran-Contra being a broad, not just one scandal, but a broad policy of cultivating anti-communist allies within the region, whether they be drug runners, whether they be dictators, anybody who they can use to create this logistic network to support the Contras and anti-communist force, and Noriega was a key ally. That changes in 1986. Ironically, Cy Hirsch publishes a story in the New York Times that details all of his connections with drug running and his deep involvement in narco trafficking, and so he became too much of a liability. But he wasn't high on the agenda of removal in the last years of the Reagan administration, or even in the first years of the Bush administration. The Bush administration kind of fell into the invasion of Panama in some ways. Well, pushed domestically. There was social movements in Panama for democracy that had been repressed, and domestic politics within the United States was pressing the White House to do something, do whatever. And Dick Cheney appeared on McNeil Lehrer and said, "We're not in the business of democracy promotion." Dick Cheney being, I can't remember, what was he in Bush? He was the Secretary of Defense under Bush, right? Secretary of Defense. And he said, we're not in the business of democracy promotion. We're going to let this play out. And he got criticized. So the Bush administration saw an opportunity and so it immediately escalates. And then it moves quickly from an effort to stop drug trafficking to the democracy promotion justification moves high up on the justification within a couple of days until Bush appears on TV and says that's the reason why we were invading Panama.
We're going to come back to this discussion, and we'll also be joined by other people. Greg Grandin, prize-winning author and professor of Latin American history at New York University. His forthcoming book, The End of the Myth, From the Frontier to the Border Wall in the Mind of America. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back with him and others in a minute.
Taking control of much of the country, but their chief target, General Manuel Noriega, escaped. Manuel Noriega belongs to that special fraternity of international villains, men like Gaddafi, Idi Amin, and the Ayatollah Khomeini, whom Americans just love to hate. But relations with Panama are under a new cloud tonight because of news reports from Jesse Helms charged today that the military strongman of Panama, Manuel Noriega, is the #1 drug trafficker in the Americas.
War has struck again in a hopeless zone. 1989, U.S. troops blew up homes. Men, women, kids, and even a pastor. Whoever they capture with no warning will live a disaster. So bloody, there's no flipping, no chapters. Only memories hard to forget. So hurtful, it creeps up again. Flashing through it, no thinking in the end. If only I knew how to stop it, I think I would live so much better, cause I'm miserable now. I lost my family and misery now. Lasers rip their flesh, killing thousands without a reason, no purpose at all. I can't believe how Bush will do this to you.
Invasion of Panama 89 by Los Racas. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
As we continue to look back at the legacy of former President George H.W. Bush and the 1989 U.S. invasion of Panama, I'd like to go back to the 1992 award-winning documentary, The Panama Deception. In this clip, community leader Rafael Olivardia and investigative journalist Robert Knight talk about U.S. military atrocities in Panama. We hear first from Olivardia.
There were many Panamanian troops at the Balboa concentration camp. They didn't seem to know what was going on. They were sitting on the grass with their arms and feet tied with plastic bands. I, along with many other people from El Chorrillo, witnessed their execution right in front of us. 8 of the soldiers at the entrance were executed by U.S. troops.
A Spanish news photographer who, in the early moments, was able to get a picture of bodies lined up in the morgue, was subsequently shot under very strange circumstances. There was not a conflict, but according to the reports of colleagues, an American soldier just took aim and shot him down. What happened in Panama is a hidden horror. Many of the bodies were bulldozed into piles and immolated in the slums where they were collected. Other bodies were left in the garbage chutes of the poor projects in which they died from the shooting, from the artillery, from the machine guns, from the airborne attacks. Others were said to have been pushed into the ocean.
That was Robert Knight, a late reporter for WBAI, in the documentary, the Oscar-winning documentary, Panama Deception. Last month, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights called on Washington to pay reparations to Panama over what was widely seen as an illegal invasion. We're joined now by international human rights attorney José Luis Morin, who's been working since 1990 to secure reparations for Panama. He's now a professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and chairperson of the Latin American and the Latin American Studies Department at John Jay, as well as Greg Grandin joining us from New York University. José Luis Morin, you get a job at the Center for Constitutional Rights in 1990. Your first day on the job, you're on a flight to Panama?
My first day on the job was to get on a plane to be part of a delegation to investigate the reports of civilian victims of the U.S. invasion. And this was a delegation of the National Lawyers Guild. I was there as part of, as an attorney for the Center for Constitutional Rights. And among the persons that joined us was attorney Hilma Camargo, who has continued to be the attorney for the victims after I left the Center for Constitutional Rights.
It's taken almost 30 years for a judgment on what happened in Panama to come out from an international body. Can you talk about why it took so long to be able to get this?
Well, when you're going against the most powerful country in the world, there's going to be pushback, and clearly the United States, for every stage of this case, attempted to claim that the Inter-American Commission didn't have the competency, that we had not exhausted all remedies as required under international law and the procedures of the Commission, and so at every stage, the United States was, and it continues to deny its responsibility.
Talk about the community, the neighborhood that was hit the hardest. We're talking a bomb every few minutes, massive bombing of Chorrillos.
So El Chorrillo is a poor neighborhood located in Panama City, and it is also the site of the Comandancia, the headquarters of the military. What the United States claimed is that it was doing a surgical strike, but it became very obvious that a whole neighborhood was put up in flames and was being destroyed in the invasion. And that meant that civilians were being targeted indiscriminately. And that's what's important about the Commission's findings, is that they did find civilians having been targeted indiscriminately, and that the United States was not taking the precautions necessary. It was acting in a very reckless and an arbitrary way in how it was trying to meet its military objectives. And under international law, that's prohibited.
And Panama also became the place where the United States tested some of its newest weaponry. The B-1, the stealth bomber, was first used in combat in Panama as well.
That's correct. And so that also struck fear in the population, because there was all this unusual weaponry that was being used. It was also the first time that the Humvee was being used as well, which replaced the military Jeep. There was all sorts of ways in which the population was being intimidated as part of this process. And because so many of these neighborhoods were the poorest, were the places where, Black and brown Panamanians lived, they could be ignored and they could be marginalized.
Let's go back to the Oscar-winning documentary, The Panama Deception.
The Pentagon used Panama as a testing ground for newly developed high-tech weapons, such as the stealth fighter, the Apache attack helicopter, and laser-guided missiles. There are also reports that can't be explained, indicating the use of experimental and unknown weaponry.
Nosotros tenemos testimonio de personas combatientes que murieron.
We have testimony about combatants who died literally melted with their guns as a result of a laser. We know of automobiles that were cut in half by these lasers, of atrocities committed by weapons that fire poison darts which produce massive bleeding.
That clip from The Panama Deception ends with University of Panama professor Cecilio Simon. Jose Luis Marin, tell us who Jose Isabel Salas Galindo is, the named person in the
Salas
suit.
is the lead petitioner in this case. We had a total of 272 cases that were filed with the commission. His case was quite compelling because not only did he suffer injuries, but his wife, Dionisia, who was at home at the time in a building that's known as a 15-story building, was struck with artillery fire. She was in the kitchen at the time. Her body was destroyed. I mean, literally destroyed in that attack while she was at home, and in ways that were just indescribable. People described that they had, because her remains were scattered in the kitchen, had to be shoveled into a body bag. The other family members also in that attack also suffered injuries, and they're part of the case.
Greg Grandin, I'm wondering your assessment of the impact of the Panama invasion on the Bush presidency, because he was always battling criticism that he was a wimp, that he was he was not fit to be president, and how this affected him.
Well, he was constantly fighting the image of being a wimp and ineffectual, living in the shadow of Ronald Reagan. He was called Reagan's lapdog. He had a long history of violence in the Third World, starting back from his days in West Texas with the Zapata Oil Company. He was involved with the CIA, which they helped run logistics to the Bay of Pigs. He, as head of the CIA, he presided over the head of the CIA in 1976 during the height of Operation Condor, which kind of organized national death squads in Latin America and coordinated their activity. The single largest run of bombings and executions carried out by Condor happened while Bush was the head of the CIA. Iran-Contra as vice president. And so Panama...
And when you say Iran-Contra, just if you could expand on that, especially for young people who don't understand what this was.
Iran-Contra was a many hydra-headed scandal that involved selling high-tech weaponry to Iran, diverting the profits to support the anti-communist Contras in Nicaragua and Central America.
In violation of U.S. law.
In violation of U.S. against law, but also it meant, my gesture to it meant that it supported the worst kind of death squatters and assassins and fascists in Central America throughout the 1980s, and Bush was deeply involved in that as vice president and coming out of his work with the CIA. So my point to the Cleveland of Panama is that Bush had a long history of violence in the Third World as a way of establishing himself, which obviously continued with the first Gulf War.
And a key part of that Iran-Contra is that once Bush becomes president, he pardons all the people who were involved with it.
No, not once he becomes president. When he's leaving,
when he's leaving as president
by Clinton in Christmas Eve, 1992, he pardoned 6 of them. And Lawrence Walsh, the independent prosecutor, says that this completes the cover-up of Iran-Contra. So, in some ways, it's a precedent for current politics in terms of the limits and limitlessness of presidential power to sweep scandals that they're involved in under the rug.
Now, President Bush defended his decision to issue the pardons. He issued a statement saying, in part, first, the common denominator of their motivation, whether their actions were right or wrong, was patriotism. Second, they did not profit or seek to profit from their conduct. Third, each has a record of long and distinguished service to this country. This is Caspar Weinberger, former Secretary of Defense for the Reagan administration, speaking shortly after he was pardoned by George H.W. Bush.
I'm completely confident that I would have been acquitted in a real trial when I and my real attorneys, Bob Bennett and Carl Rao, who are, I think, the finest in the country, would be participants, and they would present real evidence to a real jury. I am very pleased, however, and very relieved that my family and I have been spared this terrible ordeal of a very long and unjustified trial.
Now, Lawrence Walsh, who is so utterly frustrated by this, said this was the decapitation of the investigation. He had come out of the Eisenhower administration, actually. Talk about, this was Caspar Weinberger and the other defendants who had their records wiped clean.
They had the records wiped clean, and the scandal went down the memory hole. Iran-Contra was consequential in the sense that it brought together a lot of the different coalitions that made up the Reagan administration: the evangelical right, the neoconservatives, the militarists, and the anti-communists, and they gave them Central America to run wild with, basically funding the Contras, which were the anti-communist insurgencies seeking to overthrow the Sandinistas.
Michael Isikoff wrote in 1991, the Medellin cartel, once branded by U.S. officials as the world's most violent and powerful drug trafficking organization, made a $10 million contribution to the U.S.-backed Contra guerrillas fighting during the 80s to overthrow Nicaragua's Sandinista government, a former cartel leader testified today.
Yeah, I might be wrong, but I think they routed that through Manuel Noriega. That's how it got to the Contras. So it brought together all of the worst elements. But the larger point, it's all part of the overcoming the Vietnam syndrome. It's all about the executive branch figuring out how it can reassert and project military power free from all of this democratic oversight. The Congress had prohibited aid to the Contras, and that was the main kind of prompt that forced the Reagan administration to figure out.
And the main operation run through Vice President George H.W. Bush's office?
And Oliver North and an interwar party. Oliver North was the point person. He was, so there was, and so that's Bush's legacy. But it's a continuation, because if you look at his work in the 1960s with Zapata Oil Company, it's all the same dense. And the point isn't to establish conspiracy theory; it's to show the sociological overlap between these different sectors.
If you could expand on it, because clearly, even though people say he was a director of the CIA for only about a year, but he had a long-running relationship with the CIA.
His father was OSS. Which was the CIA precursor during World War II.
Prescott Bush, before he was senator.
He went to Yale, Skull and Bones. Every major player in the Bay of Pigs operation came out of Skull and Bones. I mean, there was no daylight.
The secret society
at Yale. So the CIA was like Skull and Bones writ large with $1 million budget, millions of dollars of budget, so. Again, it's not conspiracy, because conspiracy theorists are obsessed with the Bush family, and they might and might not have done this or that. But the point is that there was a close relationship between the kind of WASP, pure-blood East Coast establishment that the Bush family represented and the intelligence community. And Bush represents in some ways its radicalization in after the Cuban Revolution in Texas and then Iran-Contra. So there's a through line through Bush's life, which is being completely ignored in all of the obituaries and remembrances of Bush. And that through line is the easy resort to violence in the third world.
And you note in your piece for The Nation that it wasn't just Bush's father, Prescott Bush, who was a senator, but even his grandparents. Talk about his grandparents.
He comes from the bluest blood. Samuel Bush, Prescott Bush, his uncles. He comes from a family that occupied the highest echelons of Episcopalian capitalism in its most expansive period, when finance, industry, and energy extraction and militarism were interlocking and fusing together. And Bush was born into that in 1924 in Connecticut. He was sheltered during the Great Depression. He went to Greenwich Day School. He went to Phillips Academy and Yale. And then what's interesting, sociologically interesting about Bush is his move to West Texas. So that move represents the broadest shift of American capitalism from the East Coast to this new center of gravity, more ideological, hostile, which becomes the basis of the new right, which becomes the basis of Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush and even a lot of the forces that back Trump. So
we're going to break and then come back to this discussion. We'll be joined by Ariel Dorfman, the celebrated Chilean writer. Our guests are Greg Grandin of New York University and Jose Luis Marin, who was one of the first lawyers to bring a lawsuit against the Bush administration for the U.S. invasion of Panama back in 1989. Stay with us.
Got a country that is rich in oil, buried beneath the sand. If your population's black or brown or of strategic importance, man, pick up the phone, I'm always home, or call the White House anytime. I'll send the bombers in with a stupid grin. I'll lead a life of crime. Hey! Dirty deeds done dirt cheap. Dirty deeds done dirt cheap. Dirty deeds done dirt cheap. Dirty deeds and they're done dirt cheap. Dirty deeds and they're done dirt cheap. You got problems with the local folks, the ones you haven't shot. If you find the prisoner just won't talk, innocent or not.
Tom Morello here on Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez as we continue our coverage of the death of President George H.W. Bush, particularly looking at his involvement in Latin America. We're joined by the acclaimed novelist, playwright, and human rights activist Ariel Dorfman. In 1973, served as cultural advisor to Chilean President Salvador Allende's chief of staff. He went into exile soon after the U.S.-backed coup in Chile that brought to power Augusto Pinochet and saw the death of Salvador Allende. His new piece for The Guardian, George H.W. Bush thought the world belonged to his family. How wrong he was. He's joining us from Durham, North Carolina. He teaches at Duke University. As you watch the reporting on George H.W. Bush as he lays in state in Washington, the major funeral will be tomorrow in Washington, then one in Houston on Thursday before he is laid to rest. Can you talk about the corporate media's assessment of him and your experience of him, Ariel Dorfman?
Well, first, I'm very glad to be with you again, Amy and Juan, and of course, my old friend and former colleague, Greg Grandin. I say hello to him. I'm glad to be participating with him in this. I think that we are so in despair because of Donald Trump that there's a tendency to say, oh my gosh, oh, if only old Bush were in charge of this, things would be different. So there's a sort of a nauseating nostalgia for the past, which ends up being amnesiac about the past, as you have just so brilliantly exposed. My take on George, the elder Bush, is a very special one because I had a very special experience, which is what I speak about in my piece in The Guardian. It turns out that I spent with my wife, Angelica, 2 nights in very close proximity. In fact, just a wall away from where the former President Bush was sleeping. I was in Sydney, Australia, in end of October 2001, just a bit 6 weeks after 9/11, and I was giving the centennial lecture there. So they were putting us up in state. They had given us the best room in the Park Hyatt, overlooking the bay, looking at the Opera House. And we were asked the day after we arrived if we wouldn't mind changing our room for security reasons. And we said, no, we got the best room. Why would you possibly not? And why would we possibly give it up? And then it turned out that it was George W. Bush, H.G.W. Bush, George Bush Sr., who was there for the Carlyle Group, which is this enormous group of international capital, which was a meeting they were holding in Australia, in fact, to divest bin Laden, the bin Laden family, of everything in the Carlyle Group. We would find that out later. But when we heard that George Bush was the one who was trying to get our room from us, my wife and I were just filled with glee. We were saying, oh, boy, we are taking the room away from George W. Bush, from
George
Bush,
H.W. Bush
Sr. I mean, we had reasons. We had reasons. Some of the ones which have just been explained, right, for detesting him, but in particular, because of our Chilean connection, we thought this is a little bit of ironic history, right? Because here's the man who, from 1976 to 77, presiding over the CIA when the following things were happening. Operation Condor, which Greg Grandin just mentioned, right? Which is basically a series of death squads. But he was also presiding over the CIA when Pinochet, the dictator of Chile, had concentration camps open. They were torturing people. They were executing people. They were persecuting people. And they were killing people overseas. One of those persons was in Washington, Orlando Letelier and Ronnie Moffett, who were blown up by a Chilean death squad. And it turns out that Bush Sr., President Bush, the one we're talking about, he was complicit in leaking information to the press, saying that Augusto Pinochet, the dictator of Chile, had nothing to do whatsoever with this. And not only was he complicit along with Henry Kissinger, trying to steer the press away from the Chileans who had perpetrated this terrorist act in Washington, D.C., and blame the Cubans for having blown up Letelier. So there were many, many reasons why we were so happy to be taking the room away from Bush, right? I mean, we felt, wow, this is our tiny vicarious victory against him. A very strange coming together. Afterwards, I was a bit worried because, as my wife told me, what if something happens to this guy? Who are they going to, next door, I mean, who are they going to blame? The Chileans have all the reasons, these Chilean revolutionaries have all the reasons, to have perpetrated some sort of assault upon him. But no, the next day I saw him walking along the marina, and I have an anecdote about that as well, if you want me to tell it to you.
Go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
Right, well, I was sort of doing pre-yoga exercises in the morning. This is because the reason why it matters is because I hadn't seen Bush till that moment. But I was sort of, looking at the bay and enjoying myself very early in the morning. All of a sudden, he appears with an entourage of people around him, all of them sort of around him, surrounding him. There was this bedecked military man. I thought he was a general, but he had so much medals, I thought he was going to fall into the bay. It was so heavy. And Bush is going along. He's like with his golfing things, He's like walking. He wasn't using a tie or anything like that. And all of a sudden, he does the following gesture. The general or whoever, this officer is behind him, the entourage is around him like that. He goes like that. He snaps his finger in the air like that. This military man, this officer, takes out a little piece of cream, some cream that was there, and hands it to him. Bush doesn't say thank you or anything like that. Begins to lather himself like that, hands it back to him. And I've been haunted by that gesture, that imperial gesture, that sense of patrician arrogance, that sense that I own the world, and you know what? I can do whatever I want. And I think that there's that sense. He speaks about his decency and civility, and I have no doubt that he was decent and civil to many, many people. There's no reason why he wasn't. Certainly, he was much better than what we've got now. But there was that sense of, the world is mine. I do with it what I want. I'll squeeze Panama like I squeeze this. I'll squeeze Chile like I'll squeeze this. In other words, I own the world. The irony of it all, of course, is that his son then went on to destroy the world, right? With the Iraq and the Afghanistan invasions, and then with the destruction of the U.S. economy. And of course, that ended up somewhat softening my image of the elder Bush, because I said to myself, well, at least he's not his son, right? And then when Trump came along, we said, well, at least he's not Trump. And of course, Bush did some things that were worthy of praise. There were the terrible things he did. He did the American Disabilities Act, and he lowered the threat of nuclear war. And there's some other things. But basically, we should remember the terrible pain that he wrought. He's not really dead. He's alive in the sense that so many of his victims are alive, including myself and many other people. And of course, he gave us Clarence Thomas as a Supreme Court as a Supreme Court justice. Don't start. Yeah, but I wanted to ask Greg Grandin if I could. Very, very, very strongly, right? Yeah, I wanted to ask Ariel. And there's just and the AIDS. Let's not even speak about his attitude towards AIDS, right? He told gays that they should change their behavior, as if they were to blame for the fact that AIDS was decimating them. And don't forget that he was the vice president of Reagan. My gosh, that would be enough to condemn him to the Hall of Infamy. Well, I'd like to ask Greg Grandin, the issue of the sector of the Republican Party, of the American elite that Bush represented or was essential to vis-a-vis the Trump administration and those who are in power in the Republican Party today. Yeah. Obviously, as Ariel pointed out, there's a lot of kind of nostalgia, yearning, and a lot of the praise of George H.W. Bush has to do with the politics today, and Bush seen as the opposite of Trump. There's a continuation. There's the decay, the rot that George H.W. Bush represented. The CIA coming to power in 1988. It was a big deal that a CIA director. This was like the fulfillment of the national security state taking power. I remember nobody even talks about that anymore. But it was the first time a CIA director became president. Rot that Bush represented it delivered us to Trump. And there is a tendency to kind of posit these two people as opposites. Trump's grasping and his grotesquery, this whole shtick. But in some ways, they're mirror images of each other. You go back to that Bush family, the two grandfathers embedded in, in Brown Brothers Harriman. Their economic deals with foreign countries, including Russia, were just as sketchy and unaccountable and corrupting as what Trump is accused of, right? There might have been a moment of reform that separated those two that makes Trump seem unacceptable, but in some ways there's a continuation. And certainly the catastrophe that the first Gulf War, the second Gulf War that his son delivered onto us has laid the groundwork for the complete debasement of American politics that Trump represented. So it's not a question of this or that, comparing these two things as if they're separate, but understanding how this led to that, how Bush led to Trump. And Jose, I wanted to ask you in terms of the impact of the Panama invasion on how U.S. policy is regarded internationally in terms of the ability of the United States to act in such a unilateral form, to just come in and invade a country. So one of the things that happens almost immediately is that the international community rejects the invasion. The United Nations said that this was a flagrant violation of international law. The OAS also condemned it. And yet the United States proceeded as if it had all
authority to go ahead and do something like this. So it was really a continuation of that long history of U.S. interventions in Latin America, looking at Latin America as its backyard. And in Panama, of course, we know that it was the United States that helped even create the country. The Panama Treaty that created the country of Panama was not even signed by a Panamanian. It was all about trying to make sure that the United States could build its canal and to control that canal in perpetuity, according to the original treaty.
In the Inter-American Commission decision that just took place, what does it mean for Panamanians? Will reparations be paid? Would the U.S. even respect?
So first and foremost, and I recall distinctly the victims telling me, one of the things that we need is an authoritative decision by an internationally respected body that could say that, yes, the United States had violated the human rights of civilians in this invasion. They thought that that was just the most important thing. They knew from the very beginning getting reparations from the United States would be very difficult. But right now, unfortunately, it took 28 years, but right now we have that decision.
Greg Grandin, before we go, I want to ask you about Mexico and what's happening today. The new president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, was just sworn in on Saturday. Tens of thousands gathered in the Zócalo, the central square of Mexico City. The first leftist president in decades. In his inaugural speech, AMLO addressed security and vowed to end corruption and impunity. You wrote the introduction to his book. A blurb. You wrote a blurb for it. Talk about the significance of where Mexico is today.
Well, it's historic. It's historic for Mexico. It's historic for the region. It's historic in terms of U.S.-Mexican relations. Obviously, the crisis on the border that has been prompted by the Trump administration, but also has deep structural roots, will play out within this hope that AMLO represents. But Latin American left has been defeated everywhere else. AMLO is alone. He's isolated. I mean, Brazil, Colombia, Chile, Argentina, these are all countries, major countries that are ruled by right-wing governments. In some ways, it reminds me when Hugo Chavez came to power. It was elected in 1998 and inaugurated in 1999. There was nobody else. It wasn't until Lula was elected in Brazil that Chavez had an ally. AMLO stands alone on the hemisphere. He's got Trump to the north. He's got these rabid right-wing countries to the south, and so I think his room for maneuver is greatly curtailed. And he has both an ambitious agenda, but I think he's also known as a pragmatist and a realist. I mean, he's going to pardon criminal. You know, he's going to decriminalize a lot of low-level criminal categories, which is great, and then promising to get tough on violent crime.
And he's named a cabinet that's 50% women. 50%
women, yes. What he can do in terms of the Mexican oligarchy and its deep ties with the cartels and the military and security forces, we'll see how much room he has to maneuver. But his election he won with an overwhelming mandate, and that certainly is something.
Ariel Dorfman, we're going to give you the last word.
Yes, I just wanted to say that the problem with Bush and how he's being treated now is the incapacity of most Americans to look at themselves in the mirror and recognize what they have done to the world, which is one of the things that Bush was doing to the world. And I think that's the main problem. The main problem is we need to be able to look at ourselves and say, well, what was done there? What was that gesture, that imperial gesture, which he does like this? He snaps his fingers in the air, and he thinks that there's impunity in relation to that. He can do whatever he wants. We cannot live with a country that does that, because that country ends up having somebody like Trump, which is the excrescence of President Bush.
We want to thank you all for being with us. Ariel Dorfman, best-selling author, playwright, and poet, teaches at Duke University. Greg Grandin, prize-winning author, professor of Latin American history at New York University. And we want to thank Jose Luis Marin, professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. That does it for our broadcast. Democracy Now! Is currently accepting applications for a full-time social media manager. Details at democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tammy Warrenoff. Asaf, Sam Alkoff, John Hamilton, Ravi Karen, Hani Masood, Sharina Nadura, Taymarie Astudio, and Libby Rainey. Special thanks to Becca Staley and Julie Crosby. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.